Let's do basketball first, just because um, I trust you, just because you've been a fan for so long and you're younger. So the but I think the opinions are of somebody that's been a fan for 50 years, right? You just kind of have that range in your soul. When you're what do you want to see happen for growth in the program? Does it start with on the court stuff or off the court stuff?
I think for me, it's on the court stuff. I don't know how other people perceive this, but having watched enough Nebraska basketball, I feel fairly convinced that Fred Hoiberg is the best coach I've watched Nebraska have. So I don't particularly worry about what's happening on the sidelines or, uh, the whatever it is, setting up plays or diagramming and running an offense or like I think they have a terrific coach. I really do think Fred Hoiberg, like the amount of times they have open looks and everything in every game, I think he can diagram and run an offense. Now, do they have the right personnel to run his offense? That's kind of the big question. And so for me, it's more on the court in terms of, are you getting the right people in the right spots? Do you have the right mixture to be successful in the Big Ten? Uh, do you have the evaluation chops that you can see somebody and think that he's a shooter in one spot, but he can still be a shooter in the Big Ten? I mean, so I I also feel like they largely do a pretty good job of that. Like I know that they're this past year taking a lot of heat for not having shooters, but nobody thought that Bryce Williams would be a guy that could lead the conference in scoring when he came out of Charlotte 2 years ago. No one thought that Juwan Gary could be this type of player when he came to Nebraska 3 years ago. I don't think people thought Rienk Mast would be the central ingredient of a tournament run when he joined the team 2 years ago. So I think that Fred Hoiberg has an eye for talent too. So all of that being said, a lot of it for me is just getting it figured out on the court. And I would much rather go through a season like this where, yeah, it's unfortunate Nebraska didn't make the NCAA tournament, but they're in the conversation. They're right there. They're on the bubble. I mean, we're not that far removed from Nebraska being 9-22, or the Tim Miles era, which bookend between two really nice seasons. You had a bunch of just mediocre fodder in the middle. Like I want to avoid that whenever possible. And I know that it was an ugly start for Hoiberg, but I think he's transitioned into figuring out how he wants to play. He moved on from coaching members that I think were detrimental to the start of the operation there. And I like where Nebraska basketball is at. I think people are really upset because you want that follow up. And we saw how close it was last year, and Nebraska built a pretty good resume and then didn't finish the job. And I think it's good to have that anger, but I think it's misplaced if we're talking about moving on from Fred Hoiberg. I know that wasn't the question, but that's been the nature of the conversation for the last however many weeks.
So, Shafe, help me out here because I tend to agree with you. I do think he's pretty good at the on court coaching, getting open looks, that type of thing. I don't know that I necessarily agree on the talent eval player acquisition, although you make some good points there with the examples you bring up. But let's assume you're right on both of those, that he's got a good eye for talent and that he's got a good eye for the X's and O's in coaching. So what's the missing ingredient? Like how did we end up where we are if both of those things are true?
I mean, this sounds really stupid and simplistic, and feel free to mock it, but there's only so much you can do until guys make shots, right? Like, what else is Hoiberg supposed to do this year if Connor Essegian can't make a single three-pointer against Iowa, if he's a non-factor against Maryland, you lose both of those games. If he can't hit the three on a wide open look against Michigan, if you have a guy like that and you know what he's capable of, and he finished with the same shooting percentage as Keisei Tominaga last year from three-point, but he's not making critical shots. That's sometimes you flip a coin a bunch and it comes up tails, 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 tails. That seemed to happen to Nebraska this year. Like I can't look at this team and think that it's this colossal failure of being put together when I also thought that they were right on the precipice of making the NCAA tournament if they win two more games. Like I can't have it both ways. I can't tell you that he put together a terrible roster And yet they were right there in the NCAA tournament discussion. When you lose games because Brennan Rigsby has the best game of his life, and no one will know that name outside of Nebraska basketball fans for all of eternity. Or when you are unable to get wins against Rutgers or Iowa or whatever in the month of January. And that all comes down to coaching, and that comes down to Hoiberg, and that comes down to on-court performance. But I thought the team was good enough to be an NCAA tournament team. They beat more than a handful of NCAA tournament teams. They played up, they played down. It didn't, maybe Hoiberg couldn't get the right gauge on how to get those guys motivated or how to get those guys playing consistently. It felt like there was too often 10, 15-minute periods in a 40-minute basketball game where Nebraska was in a walkabout where they were allowing too many baskets or couldn't, avoid turnovers. But again, I think it's disingenuous to say on one hand that Nebraska was right there in the NCAA tournament picture, which it was by all accounts, and then say that they did a poor job putting together a basketball team. Like the results weren't there. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything leading up to that was bad or that, like if a couple things are tweaked or a couple things go your way or a couple shots are made, we're having a different conversation right now.
So, Schaefer, I'm glad you brought that up and put it in that way, because I would make the argument, and I'll see if I can convince you here. I would make the argument that Hoiberg is actually better, even better than we think and you think he is at the actual coaching part. But because of that, it makes it seem like he's better than he is at the talent evaluation or talent acquisition part. Like, I think
so he's maximizing lesser pieces is what you're saying.
I think that's what I hear. Yeah.
Because when it all comes back to, well, how does this guy always have his career game against Nebraska? And the shots are there, but they just don't hit them. Like, if you have better players, they make those shots. Like, that's just
I agree that Nebraska's roster was not as good as it was a year ago. And I fully agree with that. But ultimately, the guys have to make plays, right?
Right, but that's my point, right? Is they don't have guys that are going to consistently make plays. Like the talent acquisition, like maybe they got the best guys they could, but the talent acquisition, or maybe it's the development a little bit of getting those guys to the place they need to be, just hasn't been what it needs to be. Like I look at this Nebraska
when
roster,
you say you say development, like who's gotten worse?
I'm not saying anybody gotten worse, but if you look at a guy and you're like, hey, Connor Essegian has the ability to be a good shooter.
Okay, I got you.
We've got to get him to the point where he's consistent. Right?
Sorry, Schaefer. Go ahead.
So go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say part of it too is Keisei Tominaga wasn't Keisei Tominaga until halfway through his second year. Like if Connor Essegian comes back next year with Rienk Mast and you have a slightly different offensive setup and he becomes a 42% three-point shooter, we're having a different conversation about what Connor Essegian, like it's part of it when we have these talks, especially about college athletes, is they're always evolving. Like we want to have the conversation as if they're capped out at their skill level or this is exactly what a player is. And that's not necessarily true. You brought in Connor Essegian to be something more than what he was this year, and maybe he gets to that next year. If I'm going along with your line of thinking, and I don't think that you're wrong, I think that we're meeting somewhere in the middle on this. I would look at point guard, bringing in Rollie Wooster, who has an issue of shooting. Like, that's a tough decision to make. You watched Aaron Eulis all of last year in practice and decided that was good enough for you on your bench this year. Both of those guys were not good enough, quite frankly. I mean, what I wouldn't trade to have J.J. White come 50 miles down to Lincoln and replace Nebraska's point guards and what this season would have looked like with that kind of trade. I mean, I think they're a tournament team if you have J.J. White playing instead of Rollie Wooster or Aaron Eulis in those minutes. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms I have on Fred Hoiberg has been the inability to figure out point guard since the moment that he's gotten here. He's survived by having point forwards and point centers. And, for every Delano Banton and Sam Greitzel, you end up in these situations where you have Rollie Wooster on the bench in large segments of games and Eulis on the bench because you can't play them. They're not good enough for you. And so that's absolutely an area where I feel like they have to get better is they have to figure out the point guard thing.
Schaefer, when you look at, numbers get floated and who's making what. And I'm always I hate the whole NIL talk because sometimes people are just flat out wrong in terms of what guys are getting. But having said all that, are you okay? Do you feel pretty good about Nebraska's financial commitment to basketball? Because the low-hanging fruit or the narrative now is, well, they get the best that they can. They're just not spending money wisely. And it's not like they don't make runs at guys. So I think the conversation is a little more nuanced than funds available versus the guys that are getting the money.
Yeah, I I think they have support. I think it certainly could be more, which is true of everybody, right? Like that's not a knock on anything. But it's not that they didn't have money, and it's not that they didn't spend money, but where they allocated money last year did not work in their favor. And some of that was some of the money, from what I understand, some of it came in a little bit later, and you're spending on a very specific position that's going to cost more money. Then you're going to pay more for a Braxton Mia than you would have for some other guys in your class because you feel like you have to have that. And to a degree, maybe you did. But hopefully there's a better plan in place this year. There's a better understanding of what your funding is. I think last year was sort of unique because you had Juwan and you had Bryce, and so much of the portal are guys that play in a similar spot or a similar position. So you weren't necessarily seeking out those players. So you're trying to build specifically around this build of Bryce Williams and Juwan Gary. And you knew Rienk wasn't going to be back. So I think it's a little more open this next upcoming year, but they have a lot to replace. So it works both ways.
Yeah, how do you sell a placeholder knowing that Mast is coming back? Right? It's like, what are you telling a Morgan or Mia or these guys? Well, hey, this is for 1 year.
Well, that's why you're specifically looking for 1 year players. I mean,
that hard.
I think they had some other people ahead of Braxton Mia that they just weren't able to get. And so, it didn't work out as you wanted in that sense. It'll be interesting how they choose to go about it this time, because outside of maybe the two redshirt freshmen who we know nothing about in Frager and Janikowski or Janowski and Hoiberg, Essegian, and Mast, is there anybody else that we feel comfortable would be coming back? Because if that's what you have, you've got a completely wide open slate to kind of operate under there. Because Mast can be a stretch 4 or he can be a 5. Hoiberg can come off of the bench or he can play, the off guard for you. Essegian can come off of the bench or he can. So I just think that they have a more open slate to kind of work from. But at the same time, you've got a lot of statistics and a lot of scoring and a lot of, leadership that just left the team or had their last game on Sunday.
What do you do with like a Gavin Griffiths moving forward, where that's like a pretty high profile sort of, I guess, whiff from this class that probably would have been really useful? I mean, is that a guy you look at as possibly a contributor next year, or what do you do with that?
I personally would. Yeah, I mean, I would have liked to have seen him play more, especially down the stretch when you're not winning anyways. But it's hard to say. I mean, how many games did he just didn't even get on the court in that stretch? It seems unlikely that he would be back, but I would almost be willing to bet on that upside if he's willing to stick around. I mean, some of it is whatever his NIL is. Do you need that money back to give to somebody else? Does he want to just go play at a lower level so he has more opportunity? What he chooses to do can affect you there. But I wouldn't hate the idea of trying to bring him back and see what's there in a second year. I mean, I think we see so many of these guys that are plug and play players that can step in and play immediately, but there's still a handful of guys that in the old system would have had to sit out a year, would have been able to get acclimated with where they're at, acclimated in the offense, acclimated with what the conference plays like, and then would have their opportunity going forward. So I think, we judge really harshly when guys don't work immediately, but that's not the way that it used to be. There used to be more of a build-in to a transfer. Now the expectation is that you have to be able to play right away from day one.